Again, when I talked about the big kahuna earlier, I think obviously that injury was the big one. And I think everything else kind of followed from that, because you have no idea how it affects your biomechanics.
Sure.
You can be the best compensator in the world, but by definition, compensation means you're not doing it exactly the way you were before. You're compensating.
Right.
And so who knows how much just even a little change over years even can have an effect.
Hey team, welcome to another episode of the Run Healthy podcast presented by Recover Athletics. Do you like running? Well, you might owe this guy a thank you for making the sport popular in the first place. Frank Shorter is the only American to win 2 medals in the Olympic marathon, and his 1972 gold at the Munich Games is often seen as the moment that catalyzed the start of the running boom. On today's show, we bounce around Frank's career while talking about his views on running healthily. We get into what active recovery and cross-training looked like in the 70s, and talk about how he learned to accurately read his body's sensory data to help him perform his best. We also bust some myths about the legendary workouts he used to do and talk about the scenes in the famous novel, Once a Runner, that he inspired. Frank joined James and I for a conversation via Zoom. Well, so let's dive in. So we like to start with some deep investigative journalism, and this one was easy for James and I, but you had a pretty distinguished junior racing career, New England prep school champion, course record holder at every snooty prep school from Maine to New York City, and James and I know this well as we're both Middlesex guys.
Okay,
But yeah, you know the prep school league well.
Sure.
And And that kind of culminated in this big breakthrough your senior year in college. And I read in an old interview, that you discovered the double, running twice a day in the winter. And you, in one interview, described that second run as helping cut your recovery in time in half. What was it that prompted you to start experimenting with things like that?
Well, I'm not a morning person. And so early on, I realized if I were going to run twice a day, the first one, I just could never get up to run. I would always run in the afternoon. Usually after 3 o'clock, sometime after 3. You guys can appreciate this. I would study and go to classes until 3, and my reward, if I did well, was to hop on the bus and go out, to the field house and at Yale and either run there or run the cross country and do that, and then come back in and have dinner and study again. And so there was nothing like running in the morning. And I finished all my senior requirements by graduation requirements by spring break of my senior year. I'd written my senior paper by then. I'd submitted it, and as is usually the case, you hope you have some easy courses the last year. I was pre-med, and I'd save physics till last, and our physics was really pretty easy. In our study group, we learned Fortran programming in our physics study group.
Wow.
So we just sort of had an easy spring semester. So from about March on, and I really decided to do that because I had finished second in the indoor 2-mile in the NCAAs, which was really unusual, again, for an Ivy Leaguer to do that. So I came back and said, well, I'll run twice a day, a few times a week. So I did, but I wasn't a morning person. So the first morning run would be 9 or 10 o'clock. And so I would run at 9 or 10 and get done, and then go out at 3. And so I had a very, very short, it just happened that way. And I found out I could do it. And I think it's one of those things you don't know why, but even starting in prep school, as you had said, I always doubled in the meets. I ran the mile at the first race of the meet, and I ran the 2-mile in the last race of the meet. I did it. And so that just seemed normal.
Sure.
And so I just decided to run twice a day. I don't think it was every day of the week, but it was about three or 4 days a week. And it just, I just started getting better. And as you guys know, the indication is your interval training. And my interval training was just, I do the same workouts, and they were just getting faster, and the recovery was getting quicker. And my theory was I never really added volume to the actual speed running. I all year round, even when I was going to the Olympics, I ran 5K race pace or better in my interval training. in the fall, cross country, in the winter, and then in the spring. Once I got out of college, and never ran more than 3 miles worth of fast running.
And this
I really trained as a 5,000 meter runner, but that training, as I did it my senior year in college, I could see how much faster I was doing it. And I've always maintained that if you have certain workouts you repeat, and if you do them right over time, you can develop an ability to sort of predict how fast you can run in a race. So just quick example, if I ran, say, 1350 for 5,000 meters, and then I knew what the interval training was going in, if the interval training got better, I knew kind of how much faster than 1350 I could run.
Right.
And it was a reasonable expectation. So, and I just was able to do it. And after about March, April, May, 3 months of this, I finished first in the NCAA 6 mile, and again, repeating, I finished second in the 3 mile the next day. And it just seemed not unusual. And I was always able to do that from that point on. I could run consecutive races.
This is
one time, for example, in 1977, went down to Peachtree, and I actually won the Chicago 20K distance classic on Saturday and flew to Peachtree and Atlanta the next day and finished ahead of Lasse Viren and Bill Rogers and Don Cardong and and
all the legends in one race.
Yeah, and they had everybody there, and I could just do that. And so, but again, what we're talking about is injury prevention.
Yeah.
So sort of segueing back to that, I think part of it was that I didn't do big volumes of intervals. I didn't run a lot of repeat miles, slowly. And the other thing was I always ran very, very easy on my easy days. And so when I ran my hard days, I ran very, very hard. And when I ran my easy days, didn't wear a watch. And the sense of effort that I used was one that through the entire run, I would have loops that I knew the mileage of, and I would run them, and I didn't care how fast. I didn't time it. So I ran a certain distance on my easy days, but it was run at what they now call conversational pace if I were running with anyone. And I would always try to maintain this feeling through the entire workout that I will not go so hard that it will affect my next hard workout. I was always thinking about my next hard training while I was doing my easy training and use that to sort of rein myself in. And so
super interesting.
And I think it helped with the injury prevention. And then I think the other part of it was just luck. I'm light, and I was light on my feet.
My dad grew up running in the track boom, and I told him that I was going to interview Frank Shorter, and he goes, I remember watching him on TV. Nobody ever made a 5-minute mile look smoother than Frank Shorter.
Well, and so, that was part of it. And again, the other part is luck. You're eventually going to have what I always called the big kahuna. And after the big kahuna, everything kind of starts to go down. May not go down quickly.
Sure.
And for me, that started about 1976
with the
80. So I'd had about 10 years of running, at the top, and then I had a series of injuries, and I could tell that I was declining.
I remember
that's the other part of the injury prevention is I think there are two components to it. One is injury prevention when you're really running well and running hard and running at your best. And the other is injury prevention as you get older. Because you got
totally.
you got two different things you're working on here. And so the injury prevention when you're running really, really hard, nowadays I would recommend, seek out the soft surfaces. And part of that for me was I ran my interval training either on grass. I would have a field and I would know the approximate distance. And as long as I kept the records and ran that same loop, I actually developed sort of paths in a lot of the fields that I ran on. There were about 400 meters. Or I would run on a synthetic track. And so all my hard running, if you think about, was cushioned to a certain degree. It wasn't run on the pavement. I didn't do interval training on the pavement. I ran all my running on fields that were the distance of a 400-meter track or on a 400-meter track. And I think it was just instinctive, but I think it helped me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Could you talk about, I've heard that you were primarily self-coached pretty much through the middle of college onwards. I mean, Giegengack was a famous Yale coach, but from what I understand, he kind of really helped you figure out what was the best training for you. And from what I understand, beyond that, through your pro career, or I guess your post-college career, as they would call it in the days, you really didn't have an official coach, and you would get input from what I understand from other people, but you really figured out on your own?
Yeah, I did from the middle of my junior year. And I think the history there was Giegengack was the head coach in 64 of the Olympic team, track and field coach. And in 68, he was kind of an assistant or observer up in Lake Tahoe, where they were doing the high altitude training and had the Olympic trials. And there was an exercise physiologist up there who everybody still remembers named Jack Daniels. And Jack Daniels was really the first to do real empirical, well, maybe not empirical, but at least start out with the anecdotal experience. And he would see what the good athletes were doing and study it to see why it worked. I mean, that's how exercise physiology kind of started out. And he developed an interval training theory and up there. And I think my feeling is that Giegengack sort of learned from him and then passed it on through. Giegengack was a very good sprint coach. He coached Wendell Motley, who was the silver medalist at 400 meters in Tokyo. And he had a guy named Jay Luck, two guys from Yale at the same time, who was a 400-meter hurdler who made the Olympic team in 64. So, he was a good speed coach. And I think he knew about interval training, but I don't think he really knew about interval training for distance runners. He knew for short distance track runners. And I think he kind of looked to see what Jack Daniels' theory was and kind of brought it home. He brought it home from those training sessions, and that's how we learned.
And so you're self-coach for a number of years. You've got
my whole career.
Yeah. Did it go off the rails at any time? Were there any experiments that came back negative?
Not in terms of interval training, because you just had this sense when, again, in the rest and recovery, you realized that the recovery was so important that you didn't run so hard that it would affect your hard days. But the other thing I found, I know if this quite exactly explains it or answers your question, but what I found is I got in better and better interval shape doing the same workout and same workouts. In other words, I would have a schedule of workouts, long intervals on Monday and shorter intervals on Wednesday or Thursday. And I found that I wouldn't do any more running in terms of mileage on those hard days, but I found my easy days were increasing. The mileage would increase on my easy days, and it was simply a feeling of, okay, I'll go a little farther. And then, okay, that's enough. And enough increased. And so again, when you talk about recovery for athletes, don't start out saying, I'm going to run 120 miles a week. You start out with the interval training, and that never really has to get that much more. But then you find that the amount of running you're doing to recover increases. And I believe that's where the high mileage comes from. So you're not really running more distance intensely anaerobically.
Right.
You might be doing a little more jogging after a hard interval workout to feel like you're recovered, but that's not where you run the distance.
Yeah, I think that.
So again, I'm trying to bring the subject back to recovery. I think that for me, it was just an instinctive way to recover. I just knew. But the other part of it is, and again, the psychological part of it, because sure, you want to recover so you can stay out there. But the other part of it is there is a sort of placebo psychological effect of doing higher and higher mileage. Because again, a lot of this psychology and training is, my belief is your goal, no matter what your level as you're moving up, is to feel you're training in a way and at an intensity and doing that is more than your competition is doing or is able to do. It's not so much that they are doing it, but that they're able to do it. And so again, the mileage thing, it just, for me, it worked out. The easy running, in a way, helped that part of it too. I could feel I was doing more, and it just seemed to work. But
yeah,
I don't know why. I've asked my wife too, Michelle, about why I recover more quickly, and her feeling is, and she's a great triathlon coach and a good triathlete and swimmer, and she said, you just recover quickly. So, but again, I'm a natural sleeper, and I think that's another part of it. Don't be afraid to sleep. And
James as a pro naps like a world-class napper right here.
That's right.
Love my naps.
and everybody varies in the amount they need. So find the amount that suits you, and don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to do it.
Yeah, I think a red thread that kind of runs through this, your talk about your training and your approach to it, was just really being super in touch with your own biofeedback. So what your body is telling you, listening to that really acutely. But I know from reading about your career that there was a few times that there was like literally a break in the biofeedback. In 76, you had this ankle injury, and you ended up with like what we might call like a stress fracture, and then you had some brush with the medical system. Now, sports physiologist Jack Daniels and his work has given birth to doctors who are experts in running. But at that point, people must have thought you were crazy. What was the medical system solution for your ankle injury?
There wasn't. I just kept running. It turns out it was probably a stress fracture in February of 76, and I realized it was, and they had a test then, in the early days. Put your foot in a bucket, get out an ultrasound wand or whatever it was, stick it in the water, put it on the place that hurt, turn on the ultrasound, and if it hurt like hell, you had a stress fracture.
Oh, God.
And so
that's medieval.
That was the diagnosis. Because that's, and in a way, it's how they could do it before you would have to wait for the x-ray.
Sure.
Because at least what we were told then was, and I think it was true, that you can't see a stress fracture many times until it heals. You can't see that it's a fracture until it's filled in with calcium. So I knew what it was, and I knew I couldn't take the 6 weeks that you need to take off to let it heal totally, because it was coming up on the Olympic trials in May, and the first part of May. And so I just kept training, and I ran through the trials, and then I ran actually through the Olympics with it. And it's why I decided not to run the 10,000 meters in the trials. I mean, in the Olympics. So I qualified in the 10,000 in 76, but I decided not to run it because at that time, you had to run a trial. I think it was on a Friday and a final on Monday in the 10,000. They had a qualifying 10,000 on Friday and then the final on Monday, and then a week later was the marathon.
The density of competition in your era is insane to us now. Like, we look at these.
But the other point is, I learned to recover, and I think, but I couldn't risk injuring the ankle to the point where I couldn't run the marathon, because I wanted to run the marathon.
Yeah.
More than the 10,000. And that was just the realism that, I might have been a medal contender in the 10,000, but I had a better chance in the marathon. And so that was the decision.
Yeah. And bone stress injuries are super complicated. I mean, they sometimes can respond to strain. I know Peter Snell put one of his stress fractures to bed that just like kept coming back by returning to running full force. And that like stimulated, that's obviously not what now modern medicine would recommend, but
right.
did it like, was it something you could feel in every stride, or is it something that was sort of like day by day? No,
I didn't. It really wasn't painful. The only indication was I would get a cyst the size of a ping pong ball on the inside of my ankle above the nub, and they would have to aspirate it every once in a while.
Oh my God.
I had this ugly cyst on the inside of my ankle. So obviously stuff was going on. And I think fortunately, I was able to run on it, but then really for almost 2 years. And then finally one day, I think it avulsed, and the posterior tibial tendon pulled the bone out.
Yep.
From where the fracture was. And it was in the middle of a 10,000 meters. It was in the Boston Marathon, I think in April of 77. And I went through the halfway with Bill in 1:04, and I ended up running 2:18. And I think somewhere in the middle of the race, it finally avulsed, and I got on an airplane and flew out to Eugene, and not Jack Daniels, but who was the orthopedist? Who was the orthopedist out there? Anyway, I had it operated like 2 days later.
Got it. And so
Stan James was in that era. Stan James was where you went.
Got it.
You needed surgery.
Yeah. And so that, I know that injury ended up kind of becoming a recurring problem. And in 80, right. You were considering going for the LA Marathon and the Olympics, and then ended up checking down to the 10,000 because that volume just was aggravating that injury. Well,
I didn't run well in the trial. And I knew. And when I talked about the big kahuna earlier, I think obviously that injury was the big one. And I think everything else kind of followed from that, because you have no idea how it affects your biomechanics.
Sure.
You can be the best compensator in the world, but by definition, compensation means you're not doing it exactly the way you were before. You're compensating.
Right.
And so who knows how much just even a little change over years even can have an effect. And that's why at the start I said, it's important to talk about, how you prevent the injuries. But you know what? Once if you really want to keep running for as long as I wanted to keep running, you also have to acknowledge that it's going to set in, and you're going to have to learn how to recover in a different kind of way to stay out there. Not
totally.
So much to compete, but to just be able to stay out there.
Could you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, so you said that like maybe there might be compensations. Were you ever thinking about fixing your stride or maybe make it more efficient? Were you ever doing any sort of strength training, stretching, and anything the sorts that would be outside of pure running?
No, I would stretch, but a little bit. We had those 2 or 3 stretches. You'd sit on the ground and touch your toes and do the hurdler stretch, but it wasn't much. But at that time, I was also naturally very flexible.
Interesting.
I just was. And maybe that was a bad thing in a way once I got older. That
Are you still flexible?
No. After 3 back fusions, you're not that flexible.
Oh my gosh.
One thing on the subject of like that sort of zone of staying out of injury. So this is a curveball question, but I know you were roommates with John Parker, who wrote Once a Runner, and pretty much every boy who's ever gone for a mile jog is obsessed with this book. And one of the themes in the book, or one of the phrases that keeps coming back, is the injury evasion fandango of rest, ice, and stretch. did you and John come up with that phrase? And are you the originator of the Fandango?
No, that's his.
Damn, I was hoping to uncover some real.
Oh, no, I said other things, but actually a lot of the things I used to say, Kenny Moore sort of put more of them down on paper. No, John was great. And again, it was just the serendipity. I went down there in spring break my senior year, and Jack Batchelor was the best runner in the country at the time, 5,000 meters. And John, bright guy, he graduated from Florida in 3 years and started law school in his 4th year, but he still had eligibility in the SEC. So as a first-year law student, he was the SEC mile champion.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, so he knew about his running. And he wrote for he had a column in the Florida newspaper, University of Florida. It was called Fluted Columns, and he actually had a daily, he had a column. He had a column in the paper while he was an undergrad. So he was just a naturally gifted writer. Did
you read any of the drafts of that book before it became the sold out of the back of the car at track meets legend that it is?
No. I realized that, but little things like the 2-liter bottle at the end of the couch, and so you didn't have to get up to go to the bathroom, and stuff like that. It was true.
That's awesome.
I love that. So one theme that I think is interesting, and you mentioned before, I'd love to return to, is the big kahuna injury that sort of nags you and plagues you for a while, and then you managed to go on to 160,000 plus lifetime miles. So you put that injury to bed and continued going for, presumably at that point, it must be another 80,000 or something like that.
Yeah.
Talk about that longevity, and was that something you always wanted to do?
Yeah, I did, because I just love to be out there running. And, my feeling is I don't think you can't talk yourself into hard training. And the other thing is, you can't talk yourself into really understanding that in wanting to do that, I keep bringing it back to the recovery, that you really have to want to stay out there. And so that's all the more reason to try to recover as much as you can. And I don't believe that you can train as hard as you need to compete at the highest level if you don't simply just love to move across the ground that way. We all have our motions that we like, our biomechanics that we like. And again, so I know everybody's out there. That's what you found out when the running boom happened. They're just those personalities that like to do it. And for me, and I would think a lot of people out there, the stress relief part of it is still there.
Totally.
And it's still important. And I think you go into it that way. At least I did right from the start. And it's always there. And I think the further along you get, the more important it is for you to be out there. So the more willing you are to recover and go easy and in a way, not worry about PRs. So, I think one of the, and I'm not knocking the age group runners, but I'm saying age group, I think once you get over 40, my perception, it's just anecdotal of the population, both men and women, is those who start there after for the first time in their lives running, or having taken a significant period of time off, in a way have an orthopedic advantage. And so I think for me, I just decided it's more important for me to stay out there than it is to try to go and it was instinct, because I think part of that, and being honest with myself, was I don't think I can compete with that, because the orthopedics, and again, not having been injured and not having to deal with that for a significant period of time is truly an advantage. You can never, you just can never get by that. Now, there are exceptions. Joan Benoit Samuelson is unbelievable.
Yeah,
she doesn't get hurt.
Crushing it.
She doesn't get hurt, and she keeps going. And I think for her, a big part of it is her running form. If you look at her, she's a very smooth runner. Her head doesn't bob at all. at all. She just moves down the road. She's not a shuffler. And so you would think if your head isn't moving up and down, you must be sort of just shuffling. But she's not. She can run in a way that isn't a shuffle, but she doesn't have a lot of up and down motion. So I think, that helps with the impact.
Yeah, there's a biophysiologist from Harvard, this lady named Irene Davis, who I've read a lot of her papers, and she studies marathon runners who manage to have long, healthy careers. And especially amongst women, she finds there's this correlation between lightness of foot strike.
Right. So
you can heel strike all day. That's not really real science that'll hurt you. But as long as you're soft over the ground, you tend to do better in the long term.
And so, that's what I'm thinking. I'm not sure I answered the question you asked me, but that, and the other thing I did do, once I got to a point when I was about in my mid-30s, and again, this is injury prevention and dealing with injuries. In my mid-30s, I got to the point where if I would try to be honest with myself, and if I felt something nagging that I felt was affecting my stride and form and impact, the way you described, moving across lightly, if I felt it was affecting that, I literally got to the point where I could take 2 weeks off and just bicycle, and I would let it recover. I'd give it 2 weeks. And I don't know if I came up with it. I don't know why I came up with it, but I said, and I made myself not run for 2 weeks. And I found that worked. It did.
Before that, did you ever have any instances where you're like, I need an off day or I need an off week or two? Or is it just at that point in your career, you're just like, this is what I need?
Yeah, because the other part of that is, you like running as the primary way of exercising. But I also have a theory that certain people like me need to burn a certain number of calories every day through exercise. And it really doesn't matter what that exercise is. And that's another thing that sort of, I think, helped me along the way, is that made it easier for me in a way to get into cross training as I got into my late 30s and early 40s, that I realized I couldn't run as hard, and I would run to a certain point, and I had this feeling I should not go any farther or harder, but I had this feeling I hadn't burned enough calories. and so I would do other things.
Does your wife being a triathlon coach have anything to do with the bike being introduced?
No. I just did it just to train. But after I got to be, I was 39 or 40, I was biking so much compared, in addition to the running, I got to the point where I was probably only running once a day, and then I would bike. I would bike and run and bike and run. And so I thought to myself, hell, I might as well compete. So I did. And I don't know if you guys saw that, but for 2 years in a row, I was the World Masters biathlon champion.
I didn't know that.
Which was,
that's awesome.
A run. And I could finish in the top 10 in an open duathlon. And so it was, and then after that, what I would tell the people, again, for the injury prevention, and I think it helps here, is that you can get as much, not as much, but as I said, you can feel that you've gotten the amount of exercise you want to get on that day. And you can find that if you like it, you can do pretty well at it. But the other point is, and it's just my own personality, I had been brought up in a way through all of my running that I would spend at most about 2 hours a day or a little bit more running. And if you think about it, you can't run more than 20 miles. If you're going to average 20 miles a day, it's not going to take you much more than 2 hours.
Right.
And so I could kind of do that on the bike because, again, for those of you who want to try this, my bike riding was essentially always sort of a time trial. And I had routes that I would do. And again, they were basically, aero bars down and try to come close to 24 or 25 miles an hour as I could for as long as I could.
This is why the only people who can get over runners VO2 max are skiers and cyclists, because you can just go hard for 6 hours a day.
But I found, again, but there had to be easy rides too, but I could kind of do something that was like an interval training. And actually it was more like a tempo run on a bike is what it was.
Yeah,
and
that's so interesting.
I started to do a tempo run on the bike. And in a way, if I think about it, it sort of started to take the place of what turned out to be a tempo run. I never called tempo runs. I would do about 2 a month, not many. And I would just be out on an easy day. And I'd start a certain loop where I always started on an easy run. And if I felt really good, I had a loop that I would immediately get into and run and go for 45 minutes and see where I ended up. And along a loop around the campus, and the more I did it and the better I got, the further along in that last loop I would get, you see. And again, not worried about distance, but that was where I got into the lactate threshold effort. In other words, I was doing this instinctively, and then in retrospect I looked and I said, oh yeah, that's kind of a tempo run. But I would just instinctively do that.
And you're doing it all
2 or 3 times a month.
Yeah. You're doing it all on feel. What do you think about the Ingebrigtsens, like as a contrast, where their father's taking their blood lactate level in between intervals and it's super scientifically precise, as opposed to doing it on gut?
I don't know. I think I always like to train in a way that was sort of simulating a race. And stopping to test your lactate is not something you do you're not supervising your blood lactate during a race. And for me, in a race, the intervals and recovery to go hard again were training you to surge and recover during a race. It's just the difference in the fast part of it and the recovery was different. You were running faster when you were going hard, and you were going faster on your recovery.
Yeah.
But you were learning, you were going a little slower on the hard part because your intervals are faster than race pace and you have this recovery. But as you're in a race, you want that difference to be as little as possible, so that's to me what a surge is. A surge is you're going as fast as you can for a certain distance to get into a certain amount of oxygen debt with everybody else. And then what you have is the ability to recover from that surge better, because you can go at a faster pace to recover.
That makes perfect sense. And that's just a little bit of knife twisting to the guys behind you.
Yeah. And so my thing is on, testing the lactate threshold. And the other thing is, that strikes me is you have to, I think you structure your workouts, and the goal is, the goal has to be incremental as you get better and better, and attainable, gradual, incremental, and attainable. And every workout has to be, any hard workout has to be set up. For me, it was always assuming I could complete it on a bad day. And then you would hope, and more often than not, I could do better than the minimum. And then when I would have a really good day, then I could really go hard. And it seems to me that if you go in on any particular day with kind of this lactate threshold idea of doing it, you're more pressured to do the workout to your maximum, no matter how you're feeling. And so I would think if I'm having a crappy day and I'm not really running as as fast as I would like to, I don't need the lactate threshold to tell me that.
Sure.
I don't need it.
It's a you know it when you see it. You feel bad. It's there.
Yeah.
Right on. Well, I read, and this may be a good way to kind of tie it up, but I read that in 2016 you were running a lot of proud 10-minute miles. What does your training look like these days?
Oh, it's even slower.
Are you out there?
It's even slower. I run about every second day or sometimes third day, and then I jog, walk, jog, and then some days I walk. But the other thing is I ride the spin bike pretty much every day. And on the 2 or 3 times a week, usually 2 times a week that I'm not on the bike, I swim. So I'm doing all 3. But I just swim with the pull buoy and I don't do any workouts and I'm not worried about flip turns, and I'm just doing, the way I view it is it's kind of a day off for stretching, and it's a kind of stretching. Sure. And I think the recovery, and that's a huge part, I think, of injury prevention. The fact that you do the swimming, there's something about the swimming that it just stretches you in a way that nothing else does. And that's why I have such empathy for people now. I can't swim, and our gym here, Rally Sport here in Boulder, has opened up lanes for reservations, but my wife is the one, doing swimming for the family. Let's put it that way. No, really, there are only a certain number of lanes. And so she can do that, but all the people now that can't swim, I just hope they can do something else. And I hope up until this point they had been doing something else that they can find. I call it your next best.
Yeah.
They find some next best way of exercising, which I found was the cycling.
I think that I was speaking with a guy who he wrote for Competitor magazine for a while, and he thinks that this moment in history is going to launch a second running boom as a result of just like so many people taking to the streets because their gyms are closed. The normal thing that they're doing for exercise isn't available.
Right.
And I think that, who knows, obviously this is a tough time for the world, but if more people start running, that might be a good thing.
Yeah. And it's easy. But the only thing I hope what you leave in the interview for people to watch is, I truly still believe in the social distancing, even when you're running in a group. And that's me. But of course I'm 72, and I just feel that, the social distancing is real for me.
Definitely.
Yeah. We're not giving it up until the CDC says this thing's over. That's for sure.
Yep.
Well, Frank, thank you so much. This has been so much fun.
Well, thank you guys. This is great. And
I
have my morning workout. I went for a nice walk, and now I'm going to get on my bike.
Awesome.
Nice.
We were looking over 100%. We were looking over some old, I don't know if you ever spend any time on letsrun.com, but it's basically the hub for those types of crazy nerds who love to pour over people like your old training logs. And James said that you were legendary for a 400s on 90 seconds break until you couldn't break 70.
Actually, no, that's the wrong.
Okay. All right.
Well, this is like 5 sources removed, so I would like to get it from the main source.
No, the main workout was 12 by 4 times 400 meters. And it really had more to do with the speed. And the speed would start out, since I ran 5K race pace or faster, it was always under 65. And even when I ran an 800 or 1200 or an interval mile, which was at sea level, I never ran slower than 65 seconds per 400 meters.
That's ripping it for a marathoner.
Yeah, I know. But the point was, the workout was to try to come as close. And again, I didn't really time interval jogs. And so I didn't worry. I didn't make it like a swimming workout where, you run, you swim 100 on, 75
90,
seconds or something. Yeah. And what I would do, I would start out at about 63 and try to get faster and faster and faster for 12 and run as many under 60 by the end and have the last ones be the fastest and the last one the fastest, and have the average be about 60 to 61 seconds.
It's pretty
for
good.
12. and the jog would be, even at altitude here, I would start out at 100 meters. So whatever it would take me to jog 100 meters between each one of those 400s. And then once, and I would do that until I felt I couldn't keep running faster for the next one. And then I would actually bump it up to 200 meters.
Jog.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then finish the workout. So the speed was critical, and it didn't really matter how long the workout took. It was that the average was as fast as it could be. And the other way to describe how I would do it mentally, I would try to jog, say in the first part, I'm running the first 6 and I'm taking 100, or the first 8 was usually what I could do. And I would jog the 100 meters, and I would do it in a way that by the time I would realize before I jogged 100 meters that I could go again. But I didn't, and I waited for the 100 meters. And with each repeat, it would take a little longer until I felt I could go again. And the goal was to make it so that 2 steps from 100 meters on the last one that I could do and keep going faster, I felt I could go again.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, this wasn't the stopwatch, and you made the point. It was on feel. It was on feel for, okay, where am I, and have each one get faster, and then the last 4 I would do, and because I wanted to ensure that I kept getting faster, and the last one would be my fastest. In a way, it was kind of a hedge to do 200 meters. But even then, it got to the point where when I did the last one, and it was hopefully the fastest one in the workout, I get finished and I go, that's it, I'm done. I would go across the line on that last repeat, and I'm saying, the way I used to say it was, if someone came up to me and put a gun to my head and said, do one more, I'd say, shoot me. I'd say, that's it. That's it. I'm done. I'm done. And so I hope, again, I don't want to bash the lactate threshold too much, but for me, it just was always more of a feel.
Gotcha.
So this, we can issue a, don't try this at home, or if you do, be ready for some serious recovery afterwards.
Okay.
Well, thanks so much, Frank. This was really fun.
Guys.
Well, guys, thanks so much for tuning into that great conversation with Frank Shorter. I don't know about you, but I'm glad research on running injuries has come as far as it has. The ultrasound stress fracture bucket test that Frank described sounds like just about the worst thing ever. When I listen to Frank talk about his training and racing, I have one thought over and over again. This guy just totally perfected the art of listening to his body. Without the ability to rely on the fancy stuff we have today, like heart rate sensors or GPS, he had to understand the signals his body was sending him and respond accordingly. When he got it wrong, that was when injuries happened. All of us could benefit from a little bit more of that in our running. At Recover Athletics, we're on a mission to help every runner solve their nagging pain and reduce their risk of injury. Sometimes that's complicated. Runners wonder what exercises they should do, what stretches they should do. For every ache and pain, there are a million questions. We worked with top physical therapists in Boston to build the Recover Athletics app to make it simple. We connect you with the right routine for your training and injury history so you can train out pain and reduce your risk of injury. Check us out in the Apple App Store and get excited for the next podcast. Until then, run healthily, be well, and we'll see you on the next show. Same time, same place.